Have you ever heard the story of a boy who tamed a horse that no one else could control? That boy was Alexander, and his father told him, "Find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions." What's amazing is he did exactly that.
Right. Alexander started as a young prince in a small kingdom, but by the time he was 32, he had conquered much of the known world. His story is full of courage, cleverness, and moments that changed history forever.
Today we'll dive into his life, from his childhood in Macedonia to his legendary victories. We'll look at the key events that made him a hero, but also the choices that revealed his flaws.
And don't forget, Alexander wasn't just a warrior. He had a vision that went beyond battles. It's a story of ambition, leadership, and what it takes to leave a mark on the world.
So stay with us as we uncover how a fearless boy became one of the greatest figures in history.
Let's start where it all began, in the city of Pella. Alexander was born into a powerful family. His father, Philip II, was a brilliant king who made Macedonia stronger through war and alliances. His mother, Olympias, was just as fascinating, strong, determined, and deeply spiritual. She believed Alexander was connected to the gods and made sure he grew up believing it too.
That belief shaped him from a young age. Olympias told Alexander he was special, destined for greatness. But it wasn't just her words that prepared him for the future. Philip made sure Alexander trained hard, both physically and mentally. His first teacher, Leonidas, was strict and didn't accept anything less than perfection. He taught Alexander to hunt, ride, and fight, building his discipline and courage.
And then, of course, there's the story of Bucephalus. That horse wasn't just wild, it terrified even experienced riders. When Alexander was only 10, he noticed something everyone else missed. The horse was afraid of its shadow. Can you imagine a boy that young figuring that out?
It's incredible. Alexander calmed Bucephalus and rode him with complete confidence. His father, Philip, was so amazed that he said, "My boy, find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions." That moment wasn't just about taming a horse. It showed the world that Alexander had the bravery and cleverness of a leader.
Exactly. But his growth wasn't just physical or emotional. When Alexander turned 13, Philip brought in the famous philosopher Aristotle to teach him. Aristotle wasn't just any teacher. He taught Alexander about science, politics, and art, but also about values like justice and respect.
And Aristotle didn't just lecture. He made Alexander think about what it meant to be a great leader. He even encouraged him to read stories of heroes like Achilles. Those stories inspired Alexander to see himself as a hero too, someone who could change the world.
So by the time Alexander was a teenager, he wasn't just a prince. He was already showing the courage, intelligence, and ambition of a future conqueror. His early years set the stage for everything that came next.
By the time Alexander was 16, he wasn't just a prince waiting to inherit a throne. His father, Philip, saw something special in him and trusted him with serious responsibilities. One of the biggest tests came when Philip went to war against Byzantium and left Alexander in charge of Macedonia. Can you imagine that? A teenager running a kingdom.
It sounds unbelievable, but Alexander proved he was ready. Not long after Philip left, a tribe called the Thracian Maedi thought they could take advantage of the young ruler. They rebelled, probably thinking Alexander would be too weak or inexperienced to stop them. But they couldn't have been more wrong.
Instead of waiting for his father to come back, Alexander acted fast. He gathered an army and marched straight into the Medes' territory. He didn't just defend Macedon, he attacked them on their own land. That bold move completely caught the Maedi off guard.
And it worked. Alexander led his troops to a clear victory, forcing the Maedi to retreat. But here's what makes this story even more impressive. He didn't stop there. After the battle, he founded a city in their territory and named it Alexandropolis, after himself. It wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about making a lasting mark.
That's what stands out about Alexander. Even as a teenager, he didn't just think like a warrior. He thought like a ruler. He wasn't just protecting his kingdom. He was expanding it and showing his people that he could lead with strength and vision.
and his success didn't go unnoticed. When Philip returned, he must have been proud to see what his son had accomplished. This victory proved Alexander wasn't just Philip's son. He was a leader in his own right. It also earned him the trust of the army, which would be crucial for the challenges ahead.
Exactly. By the time Alexander was in his late teens, he wasn't just a prince anymore. He was a proven leader, both in battle and in strategy. His early victories gave him the confidence to take on even bigger challenges, and they showed the world that Alexander was someone to watch.
Alexander's early victories were impressive, but they were just the beginning. Everything changed when his father, Philip, was assassinated during a celebration. It was sudden, shocking, and it left the kingdom on the edge of chaos.
Absolutely. At just 20 years old, Alexander was now the king of Macedon, but his position was anything but secure. Rival leaders and even some of his own allies saw this as their chance to take control. It wasn't just a question of being strong. Alexander had to act fast and be smarter than everyone else.
And that's exactly what he did. Alexander quickly eliminated anyone who could challenge his rule. This included rivals in the royal family and others who had enough influence to threaten his throne. These decisions were tough, even brutal, but Alexander knew he couldn't afford to show weakness.
At the same time, he couldn't just focus on securing the throne. Some Greek city-states like Thebes and Athens thought Philip's death was an opportunity to break free from Macedonian control. But Alexander wasn't about to let that happen.
Right. Instead of waiting for these cities to gain strength, Alexander acted immediately. He marched south with his army to show the Greek states who was in charge. Some cities surrendered peacefully, but Thebes chose to resist.
And Alexander's response to Thebes was decisive. After a hard-fought battle, he destroyed the city almost completely, leaving it as a warning to others. This might sound harsh, but it worked. The other Greek states quickly fell in line, realizing that Alexander was every bit as powerful and as determined as his father had been.
That's what set Alexander apart, even in these early days. He combined strategy with action, showing both his enemies and his allies that he was a leader to be respected and feared.
By the time Alexander had unified Greece under his control, he wasn't just a young king holding on to power. He had built the foundation for something much bigger. The stage was set for the campaigns that would make him a legend.
With Greece under his control, Alexander didn't waste any time. His eyes were set on something much bigger, the Persian Empire. At just 22 years old, he gathered an army of 40,000 soldiers and crossed into Asia. His goal wasn't just to defeat Persia, it was to change the course of history.
The first major challenge came at the Granicus River. The Persian army, led by local commanders, was waiting for him. Crossing a river to fight was incredibly risky, but Alexander didn't hesitate. He led his men straight into battle, fighting alongside them in the front lines.
That's right. His bravery inspired his troops, and his tactics confused the enemy. After hours of intense fighting, the Persians were defeated. It was a huge moment, Alexander's first major victory against Persia. It showed both his army and his enemies that he was fearless and skilled.
But the campaign was far from over. One of Alexander's toughest challenges came at the city of Tyre. The Persians had turned Tyre into a fortress, and it seemed impossible to capture. The city was built on an island with strong walls, and Alexander didn't have a navy big enough to attack by sea.
So what did he do? He built a causeway, an actual road through the water to reach the island. It took months of hard work, but eventually, his army was able to march across and breach the walls. That kind of creativity and determination was what made Alexander unstoppable.
And it wasn't just about winning battles. Along the way, Alexander founded cities, the most famous being Alexandria in Egypt. He didn't just name these places after himself to show his power. He wanted them to be centers of learning, trade, and culture.
Exactly. Victories like Tyre and the founding of Alexandria built his reputation as a ruler who was not only invincible, but also forward-thinking. By the time he reached Egypt, he was already being called Alexander the Great.
It's incredible how quickly he rose to this level. But this was only the beginning. With each victory, Alexander's ambitions grew. He wasn't satisfied with what he'd accomplished so far. He wanted more, and Persia was still waiting.
After his early victories in Asia, Alexander moved deeper into Persian territory. His next big challenge was King Darius III, the ruler of the Persian Empire. They first met at the Battle of Issus, where Darius had a much larger army. But Alexander's clever tactics turned the fight in his favor.
Darius thought sheer numbers would win the battle, but Alexander had a different plan. He used his army's speed to break through the Persian lines and target Darius directly. When the chaos began, Darius fled the battlefield, leaving behind his soldiers, and even his family.
That victory was a turning point. It showed everyone that Alexander wasn't just fighting for land. He was fighting to take the Persian throne. After Issus, he captured cities filled with treasure, strengthening both his army and his reputation.
But the real test came at the Battle of Gaugamela. This was Darius's last chance to stop Alexander. The Persian army was enormous, with war chariots and an open battlefield to use them. Still, Alexander's strategy outsmarted them again.
He led a bold attack straight at the Persian center, forcing Darius to flee once more. With that victory, Alexander became the ruler of the Persian Empire. But his conquest didn't stop at just battles. His leadership style also stood out.
That's true. Alexander wasn't just focused on fighting. He wanted to unite the people in his new empire. He adopted some Persian customs, wore their clothes, and even encouraged marriages between Macedonians and Persians. He believed this would help create a stronger, united kingdom.
But not everyone agreed with him. Many of his generals, especially the Macedonians, didn't like these changes. They thought Alexander was abandoning their traditions and becoming too much like the Persians.
It created real tension within his army, but Alexander stood firm. He believed that uniting different cultures was the only way to keep such a vast empire together.
By the time Darius was betrayed and killed by his own men, Alexander had become the king of kings. Yet, his dream of building a united empire was just as important to him as his military victories. It was a vision that made him great, but it also led to challenges that would grow even more difficult in the years ahead.
After taking control of Persia, Alexander's ambition only grew. He set his sights on the lands of India, believing that conquering the entire known world was his destiny. His army, though tired, followed him as they marched east into unfamiliar territory.
India wasn't like anything they had faced before. The terrain was rough, the weather was harsh, and the local kingdoms were strong. One of the toughest battles came against King Porus, who ruled the region of Punjab. His army had something Alexander's men had never seen before: war elephants.
Those elephants were terrifying for the Macedonian soldiers. They weren't just huge, they were also dangerous in battle, trampling soldiers and crushing enemy lines. But Alexander, as always, stayed calm and used strategy. He divided his army to confuse Porus's forces and attacked from multiple sides.
The plan worked, and after a fierce fight, Alexander defeated Porus. But here's what's interesting. Alexander didn't punish Porus. Instead, he admired his bravery and allowed him to keep his throne. This decision wasn't just about kindness, it was also smart. By respecting Porus, Alexander gained a loyal ally in the region.
That shows a different side of Alexander, doesn't it? He wasn't just a conqueror, he understood the value of diplomacy. But even as he won battles, his army began to lose its spirit. After years of war, his soldiers were homesick and tired of constant fighting.
The breaking point came at the Bees River. When Alexander wanted to push further into India, his troops refused. They begged him to let them return home. For the first time, Alexander had to give in. He turned his army around, but the journey back was far from easy.
They faced deserts, rivers, and disease on the way back. Many soldiers didn't survive the harsh conditions, and even Alexander fell seriously ill at one point. Despite everything, he stayed with his men, sharing their struggles and pushing them forward.
By the time they returned to Persia, the army was smaller and weaker, but Alexander wasn't ready to stop. He began planning new campaigns, this time to conquer Arabia. However, before he could start, tragedy struck.
In Babylon, after a night of heavy drinking, Alexander became ill with a fever. Within days, he was gone. At just 32 years old, the man who had conquered so much of the world was dead.
His empire, the largest the world had ever seen, didn't last long after his death. His generals divided the land, and his dream of unity fell apart. Still, Alexander's legacy is impossible to ignore.
He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a leader, a visionary, and a man who changed history forever. Even now, his name is a symbol of ambition, courage, and the cost of chasing greatness.
From taming a wild horse as a boy to building the largest empire of his time, Alexander's story is one of incredible ambition and vision. He wasn't just a warrior. He was a leader who dreamed of uniting people from different cultures under one rule.
But his journey also reminds us of the cost of greatness. His victories came with challenges, and his early death left his empire divided. Even so, his name has echoed through history as one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known.
What do you think about Alexander's life? Was he a hero, or was he too ambitious for his own good? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
And don't forget, let us know which legend we should cover next. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join us for more amazing stories from history.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.